Misogynistic millionaire grabs the neck of a homeless woman in front of his company, unaware that she had a military past that would end him. In a second, everything changed. Henry Devereaux, with his expensive suit and arrogance to spare, was about to learn a lesson he would never forget. In front of his company, on an ordinary morning, he put his hand on the neck of Sarah Williams, a homeless woman. Was she defenseless? No, she was much more than that. What Henry didn't know was that Sarah wasn't just a woman on the streets. She was a force to be reckoned with, someone with a past so powerful it could bring down empires. And in that exact moment, he made the wrong choice. Henry Devereaux had always been a man who liked being at the center of power. He wasn't just a millionaire. He was a walking empire. Owner of a global company, his name resonated in luxury boardrooms and on the pages of business magazines. His suit was always aligned, his hair perfectly combed, and his penetrating gaze as if he were always ahead of everyone else. He didn't see others. He saw resources, numbers, results. People were just pieces in the game he mastered with expertise. For Henry, the world was a competition and he was the winner. With his wealth, he believed the world bowed before him. He possessed a vision of himself as a self-made man, someone who achieved everything he had through merit and hard work. Throughout his life, he cultivated an unbeatable mentality, a world in which strength, the beauty of ambition, and competitiveness were the only currency of value. But there was something more, something he hid well, not only from his co-workers but also from himself. A chronic misogyny that was rooted in his personality, although he never recognized it as such. For Henry, women were just secondary figures, without importance. They were there to be admired, yes, but always from a distance that kept them in their place. He believed the women he encountered in his life were destined to serve him or be impressed by his superiority. He didn't understand their struggle, their difficulties, their battles. Not because he was stupid or ignorant, but because for him, these things simply weren't part of his world. He had an empire to command, and his vision was centered only on his own reflection in the mirror, surrounded by the glow of his riches. On that particular day, he was heading toward his company building. It was an ordinary morning, or at least it should have been. The streets were busy, traffic followed its chaotic flow, but everything was in order. Henry walked the sidewalks as always, with an arrogant look and a firm step. He was about to enter the building when he saw something that made him stop for a moment. In front of him stood Sarah Williams. Sarah wasn't an imposing figure. She didn't wear expensive clothes nor carry any sign of power. She was dressed simply, with dirty clothes and a plastic cup in her hands. A clear reflection of a life that life had stolen from her. She was there in front of his company, and what seemed to be a simple and almost irrelevant request, water, was enough to attract Henry's attention. The sight of her, the misery stamped on her face, seemed to be, for him, an image of total worthlessness. It was something he rarely saw in his life and that he allowed himself not to notice. For Henry, people like Sarah didn't exist in his world. They were invisible, marginalized, irrelevant. But Sarah, standing there before him, did something that no businessman was prepared to do. She made him stop. She didn't say a word. The silence between them seemed absolute. The only sound breaking the silence was the murmur of the street in the background. Somehow her gaze was deep, intense, but also sad. She wasn't asking for sympathy. She wasn't trying to gain something. She was just there, existing, in the purest form of human need. Henry looked at her, but his gaze wasn't one of curiosity, empathy, or compassion. It was one of contempt. He approached. For him, she was just one more of the crowd. But his attitude, his gesture, was the same arrogance he had already demonstrated to so many other people. He advanced and with a quick movement grabbed Sarah's neck. There were no words. There was no hesitation. For Henry, it was a simple gesture of control, as he had always done in his life. Dominate, subjugate, reduce to zero anything or anyone seen as inferior. He thought she was weak. He thought she had no defense against him. And in his mind, that's how things should be. He, powerful and unpunished. She, vulnerable and submissive. It was the cycle he knew and controlled with mastery. But he was wrong. Sarah wasn't just a homeless woman, helpless. She wasn't a victim of life. She had something Henry would never imagine. Something he couldn't see in the moment, but that would begin to be revealed. A layer of depth he couldn't begin to comprehend. While Henry thought the situation was under his control, Sarah, with calm and skill, began to move. Her body, though tired and fragile in appearance, was in motion, with impressive precision. Somehow, without any desperate reaction, she turned him around, and the scene changed instantly. The game was about to change. The situation, which for Henry seemed to be an easy victory, was beginning to take a different course. But what would really happen there? Henry, with his air of superiority, could never imagine he was facing something much greater than any businessman, any millionaire could predict. The woman he was trying to humiliate wasn't a being devoid of strength. She possessed something that would make Henry's arrogance seem like a joke, something that, in a silent way, was about to make him learn the hardest way possible. And the story was just beginning. Sarah Williams wasn't a simple homeless woman. That fragile figure forgotten by the city streets had a history that few could imagine. She wasn't just another homeless person seeking the next meal or a bit of comfort. In fact, her gaze, contrary to what many saw, didn't just carry the sadness of the street, but the experience of a life filled with challenges and overcomings. For Henry, she was a shadow, but for others, she was a threatening shadow. She wasn't born there in the dark corner of society. Sarah's life had begun in a small town, far from the concrete and bright lights that dominated the metropolis where Henry lived. From a young age, she stood out for her determination and courage. She was the girl who got up when others fell, the girl who never let herself be beaten down. She had a rare ability to survive, something that shaped itself over time, without her knowing that one day it would save her life. However, life's choices don't always follow the planned path, and Sarah's route, marked by a series of personal tragedies, took her far from the sweet youth full of dreams. Still young, Sarah enlisted in the army. It was a decision made by a combination of necessity and desire to escape. She needed to find a purpose, something greater than herself. The soldier's life wasn't easy, and much less feminine in the eyes of many. In an environment dominated by men, she had to fight not only against the challenges of the battlefield but also against the looks and prejudice that judged her by her appearance and origin. But Sarah didn't care. The army offered her something she could never have had in her previous life: structure, discipline, and a form of resistance that prepared her for any adversity. For years she trained tirelessly, overcoming limits and barriers that many thought insurmountable. It was in the army that she truly became who she was. She was no longer the lost and aimless girl, but a woman with training, skills, and a sharp survival instinct. What seemed to be an escape was actually her most powerful formation. In a time of war, Sarah stood out in various rescue missions and combat strategies, showing innate leadership and an ability to adapt that made her one of the best in her unit. She didn't just survive but transformed into someone feared on the battlefield. Over time, her military career took her to places where suffering, pain, and struggle were daily. But nothing prepared her for the biggest blow she would suffer. During a mission, something went wrong. A miscalculation, a communication failure, and Sarah's team was caught in an ambush. She survived, but at the cost of losing all her friends and companions in her unit. The loss shook her deeply, and it was this event that made Sarah rethink her life and step away from her military career. Grief and guilt dominated her, causing her to distance herself from the army and eventually from society. War didn't just take her from the front line, but also ripped her from the life she knew. But like any war veteran, she couldn't forget the lessons she had learned. Sarah transformed into a more cautious woman, with eyes always alert, even in the calmest moments. She became a ghost to the world, but within her still lived the strength of a soldier. The discipline, resistance, and courage that were forged in the trenches of war were in her DNA, even if her new life was no longer on the front lines. However much she tried to hide in the city's shadows, Sarah was never truly invisible. She carried with her the strength of what she had been. And while others saw her as a homeless woman, lost and forgotten, the world didn't know she had been trained to be much more than that. She was a woman capable of surviving any situation, even when everything around her was crumbling. She knew what to do when danger arose, and more importantly, she knew how to use this to her advantage. And it was precisely this survival ability that would make her face Henry Devereux in a way he could never imagine. While Sarah wandered the city streets, her mind was still sharp, as if the training had never ended. She knew the world didn't respect her, that the streets were relentless, but there was something in her mind that would never let her yield. She knew that any adversary, no matter how powerful, could be defeated if she used the right tools. And when Henry Devereux approached her, judging her as a woman without value, without strength, and without future, he didn't know he had just put himself in the path of something much greater. The man who believed himself unbeatable was about to be confronted with a woman who had more power in one finger than he would ever have in his life. Sarah's story wasn't just about survival. It was about revenge, about the power of transformation, and about the unbreakable strength a woman can have when forced to face the world in a cruel and unexpected way. Henry didn't know, but he was about to learn a lesson that would change his life forever. The morning was illuminated by the sun, and the city, with all its agitation, seemed nothing more than a distant backdrop for what was about to happen. Henry Devereux, with his confident walk and arrogant posture, was heading toward his company building. He was a man who possessed the world under his control, or at least believed so. He didn't imagine that this day, apparently ordinary, would transform into one of the most significant of his life. He was about to cross paths with someone he would never have imagined. Not just anyone, but a woman who carried more strength than he could perceive. Sarah Williams, the homeless woman, was sitting on the sidewalk, her empty plastic cup in front, asking for help in a silent way. She knew the world wouldn't offer help, but hope, however small, was still there. She didn't want pity. She just wanted a bit of compassion, a chance to perhaps live with dignity for a moment. She was so accustomed to the coldness of the streets that she no longer expected much from people who passed by. However, when she raised her eyes, she saw Henry approaching. He observed her for a moment. The expression on his face reflected something Sarah already knew very well. He didn't see her as a person, but as an obstacle, something to be ignored, devalued, discarded. For him, she was nothing more than another image of misery in a world full of people like him, powerful, rich, and above all, insensitive to the struggles of those he considered beneath him. He was accustomed to having things his way. If he wanted, he took. He thought that, as always, he could dismiss her with a word, with a gesture. But what he didn't know was that what was about to happen there wouldn't be anything like he imagined. The scene could have been banal, but it wasn't. Seeing Sarah there without reaction, just waiting for something that would never come, Henry decided to act. He approached her with a condescending smile, that smile he always used when he felt superior. He stopped in front of her, looked at the empty plastic cup, and with a brusque and merciless movement grabbed her neck. Sarah, still sitting on the ground, didn't make any defensive movement immediately. She didn't react. Her body became rigid, but her mind, which for so long had become accustomed to surviving, was already on total alert. Henry was comfortable in his superiority. He had immense strength, not only physical but psychological, and felt that in that moment he had absolute control. He looked at her with disdain, his eyes without any sign of empathy. He believed he was dealing with someone weak, someone who couldn't offer resistance. "What are you doing here? Don't you realize you're in the way?" he thought. He didn't know that this gesture, this simple attack of arrogance, would be the beginning of his downfall. Sarah, on the other hand, wasn't a vulnerable woman. She was trained to deal with dangerous situations, to maintain calm even when everything around seemed to crumble. While Henry squeezed her throat with force, she didn't yield to pain, didn't yield to panic. She had been through much more intense situations, and this wouldn't be different. The memories of military training, of facing much more fearsome adversaries, quickly returned to her mind. She knew what to do. With a quick and precise movement, Sarah, who seemed completely defenseless, moved in a way to escape the aggression. She didn't fight physically with Henry the way he imagined. Instead, she used what was most important for a person in her position: the ability to react, to turn the situation to her favor. She spun with military precision that Henry would never anticipate. In an agile movement, she pushed him backward, making him lose his balance. Henry's strength, although great, wasn't enough to maintain control over the situation. Henry, surprised, stumbled and fell backward. His arrogance had been replaced by confusion and disbelief. He couldn't believe what had just happened. He, a man who had always controlled everything around him, was now lying on the ground, with the woman he had tried to subdue standing before him, firm and calm. Sarah, though still in a vulnerable position, had the advantage. She wasn't there to fight physically with him. She was there to teach him a lesson he would never forget. The shock on Henry's face was visible. He didn't know what to do, how to react. He, who had always had power in his hands, was now facing someone who didn't bow before him. Sarah, with the calm that only someone with a military past could have, took a step forward. She didn't look at him with anger. She wasn't there for revenge. She simply stood up as if she were on a mission, as if it were just another task to be accomplished. For her, it wasn't personal. It was just the reflection of a lifetime of training and overcoming. Henry, in turn, stood there, motionless for a moment. He, the man who thought himself so strong, now had his eyes wide open, not knowing what to do. He never imagined that someone like Sarah, someone he had ignored as simple, would be capable of something so extraordinary. He tried to regain composure, tried to understand what had just happened, but all he felt now was a growing fear. He knew something was about to change. He just didn't know how much it would affect him. Henry Devereux was stunned. He could barely process what had happened. The woman he believed to be a fragile figure, a shadow of the streets, had shown herself to be stronger and more skilled than any of his most experienced associates. He was on the ground, his stomach tight with humiliation, still not understanding how a simple homeless woman could have reacted with such skill. But the most impressive thing wasn't just the fact that she had knocked him down. It was the calm way Sarah had done it. She wasn't enraged, not even altered. Her expression was impassive, and her posture, though simple, was firm. She wasn't there to fight. She didn't want to gain anything. She was there, as she had always been in her life, just to survive. But in doing that, she not only freed herself physically from Henry's aggression, but also put him in a vulnerable position he would never have imagined. Sarah looked at him, with a calm that bordered on coldness. And the last thing Henry expected was that she wouldn't be even slightly intimidated by what had just happened. She didn't look at him with hatred or anger. There was a lightness in her posture, as if all of that were, in a way, banal, as if she had seen much worse. In a way, she found herself once again confronting someone who thought themselves superior, but this time, she held the cards. Henry, still on the ground, tried to get up. His movements were clumsy and he was breathing heavily, something he would never have allowed if it were another situation. He stood up, hesitant, still not knowing how to react. The pain in his ego was almost palpable. He wasn't accustomed to being challenged like this, especially by someone he had judged to be so inferior. "Who are you?" he asked, trying to maintain composure, but his words came out more like a whisper from someone losing control. He was beginning to realize he knew nothing about the woman before him. He thought arrogance would protect him, but now he was in unknown territory. Sarah didn't respond. She simply observed. She wasn't there to justify herself. There was nothing to be explained. She knew he wasn't ready to understand who she really was. He probably never would. For Henry, this was a simple power struggle. He thought the world revolved around his rules and his vision of superiority. But there, in the middle of the sidewalk, in front of his luxury empire, he was beginning to understand that what he believed to be control was just an illusion. And he was beginning to feel it firsthand. Sarah didn't move away, didn't turn her back. She remained there standing, tranquil, her presence seeming to occupy the space in an imposing way. It wasn't a direct threat, but something deeper. She didn't need to shout or engage in physical combat. She had something he would never have. She had control over the situation in a way he didn't understand. Sarah's power wasn't in her physical strength, but in her ability to maintain calm, to stay in control, even when everything around seemed out of place. She was like an iceberg, serene on the surface but with complex and impenetrable layers below. Henry, no matter how hard he tried, couldn't hide the confusion and insecurity in his gaze. He was beginning to realize that Sarah wasn't just any woman. She wasn't a victim of circumstances. She wasn't a vulnerable person. She had control of the situation in a way he had never experienced before. The street was silent. The world around seemed to be on pause. Passers-by looked on curiously, but no one approached, perhaps due to the tension in the air. Neither moved. The scene unfolding there was much more than a simple confrontation. It was the clash of two realities, two completely different forces, but somehow equally implacable. Sarah, with an almost imperceptible lightness, took a step forward. She wasn't in a hurry. There was nothing she needed to do immediately. The scene was unfolding exactly as she expected, or perhaps as she knew it should happen. She knew Henry would never understand, but she also knew he would eventually realize the impact of this situation. Henry, however, wasn't ready for that. He looked at Sarah again, and now his gaze was different. It was no longer the gaze of a man who felt superior, but of someone who was finally beginning to realize that things might not be as he imagined. He, the millionaire, the man who controlled everything, was facing a woman who didn't bow before him, nor cared about the world in which he lived. The shock was enough to make him question his own perception of what power meant, but he didn't know what to do with that. He still didn't understand, wasn't prepared for this lesson. Sarah then took another step forward, but not because he deserved another response. She did it because she knew what was happening. There was no longer about him. It was about her. It was about how she was freeing herself from the invisible chains the world had placed around her. Henry Devereaux was just a detail. The fight hadn't ended yet, but the game was already on another level. Henry had underestimated Sarah, and now he was beginning to understand that true strength wasn't in his pocket, but in her unbreakable spirit. The homeless woman was somehow controlling the narrative. Henry Devereaux was still standing, but his confidence had dissipated. He tried to recover his posture, but discomfort, humiliation, and restlessness took hold of him. He had never been challenged in such a way, and this was destabilizing him. He didn't know how to act or react. What he initially thought would be a simple power encounter, where he would humiliate and dismiss a homeless woman, was now transforming into something much more complex. While Henry regained composure, Sarah remained silent. She wasn't there to dialogue or justify herself. She knew Henry would never understand her story, and that didn't matter. She had no intention of impressing him or asking for forgiveness for her existence. For her, what was happening there wasn't a battle for power or control, but something much deeper. It was about her freedom. Freedom to be who she really was, far from any stigma, far from any judgment. She stood quietly, but within herself, what was happening there was a return. The return of a woman who had been forged in battles much more intense than any confrontation Henry could imagine. The moment of silence was interrupted by an internal voice from Sarah. It was time to show him who she really was, not just a homeless woman, but a woman with a past marked by struggle. She had a history he could never comprehend. Not because of his arrogance, but because he had never lived on those streets, never felt the weight of loss and the fight for something more than mere survival. He didn't know what it was to carry the pain and resistance of a world that didn't respect her. Sarah looked at Henry with her calm but deep eyes. She knew he was now thinking about everything that had happened. He was trying to understand what was happening and what it meant, and it was in that moment, with the weight of history in her words, that Sarah revealed part of her truth. "You think you know me, Henry," she said, her voice firm but without anger. "But you know nothing about me, nothing about what I am." Henry looked at her, still without understanding. Sarah then made a decision. She knew that on some level he needed to understand. She didn't want to challenge him further, but the situation demanded it. She needed somehow to show him that appearances were deceiving, and that no one, especially him, could judge someone without knowing the path life had imposed on that person. With a tranquil gesture, she took a crumpled photo from her pocket. The image was slightly torn but still visible. She held it in her hands and looked at it for a moment before handing it to Henry. He, somewhat perplexed, took the photo and observed it. It was an old photo of a young woman in military uniform, alongside other soldiers. Sarah was there, smiling, but at the same time with the eyes of someone who already knew what it was to fight, what it was to be on the front lines, what it meant to carry the lives of others in one's hands. She was there, but it was a version of herself that Henry would never imagine. It was the portrait of a woman who, above all, had been a soldier, a fighter. Henry looked at the photo, then turned his eyes back to Sarah. His mind tried to process the images. He looked at her, a homeless woman wearing dirty clothes and without any sign of power. But there, in the photo, he saw another woman. He couldn't understand. How could someone like her have been trained for war, for survival on a battlefield, to deal with challenges far beyond his comprehension? The shock was clear on his face. Sarah, seeing Henry's expression, said nothing more. She knew he would never fully understand. He would never be able to see beyond the facade he had created about the world. But by showing that photo, she wanted him to know one thing. He wasn't dealing with someone who had been defeated. He was dealing with someone who had fought to the end, someone who had an internal strength that couldn't be measured in wealth or power. Silence returned to dominate the environment. Henry, now completely perplexed, looked at the photo and then at Sarah. He wanted to speak, wanted to ask, but his words failed. He, who had always had control over any situation, was now facing something he couldn't comprehend. And the most disconcerting thing for him was that Sarah didn't need to say anything to dominate the situation. She had already won in a way he could never imagine. Sarah knew that was the turning point. Henry now had a choice to make. Continue on the path of arrogance, believing the world bowed to him, or begin to question everything he knew about power and control. But she wasn't there to force him into anything. She just wanted him to know that no matter how hard he tried, he would never fully understand the strength of someone who knew how to fight when everything seemed lost. Sarah Williams wasn't a victim. She never was. And in that moment, when Henry finally looked at her, he felt something he had never felt before. A deep discomfort, as if the true lesson was about to be given. He was facing someone who could destroy his life, not with physical force, but with something much more powerful. The truth. The air around Sarah and Henry seemed dense, almost palpable. Everything was silent, and while traffic and city life continued in the background, what was happening there seemed to transcend the mundane. Henry, still holding the photo in his hands, couldn't take his gaze away from Sarah. He was deeply disturbed, and for the first time in his life, he felt a discomfort he couldn't control. He, a man accustomed to absolute power, felt powerless before a woman who not only possessed silent strength, but also a truth he wasn't prepared to face. Sarah, in turn, was unperturbed. She remained firm, her hands holding the remnants of dignity that he, with his thoughtless gesture, had tried to take away. She knew what he felt, and she also knew he had no idea how close he was to being destroyed. For her, the situation wasn't about revenge or anger. There was no desire for destruction, but rather the realization that Henry, with all his wealth and arrogance, was nothing more than a man who, like all others, could be brought down, not with violence, but with something he could never buy: the truth. She approached Henry, unhurried, with a calm, almost methodical step. She observed him, still maintaining calm, while he tried to process what was happening. He thought he was in control, but what he didn't know was that the real battle wasn't in his hands. The battle was in Sarah's spirit and mind, and she held the reins of this fight. Henry, still dazed, tried to regain composure. He knew what was happening there wasn't simple. He could no longer see Sarah as the homeless woman he had seen at the beginning. He now looked at her with reluctant respect, a kind of recognition he never thought he would feel. He was facing a woman who, for the first time in his life, he couldn't control. "You think everything you have will protect you, Henry?" Sarah asked, her voice soft but loaded with a weight that seemed to drag through the air. She didn't speak with anger, but with cutting clarity. Henry didn't respond. He didn't know what to say. The words were stuck in his throat, as if he had lost the ability to speak. He wanted to shout, wanted to try to regain control of the situation, but he knew deep down that this was impossible. He was completely at the mercy of something he couldn't understand. Sarah continued, her voice maintaining the same calm and impersonal tone. You spent your entire life believing that money and power would protect you, that your arrogance would make you invincible, but in the end you never had the control you thought you had. Today you're seeing what happens when someone finally looks into your eyes and sees you as you really are. Vulnerable, small. Sarah's words weren't just an attack on Henry's ego. They were a revelation, a truth he had always known somewhere deep in his consciousness but had never been forced to confront. He had always felt above others, but now he was on the ground, physically and psychologically, before a woman he thought was inferior. He was beginning to realize that all the power he thought he possessed was just an illusion. The city, with its busy streets and glass buildings, now seemed like a prison, and he the prisoner of his own arrogance. Sarah took a step forward, and Henry instinctively stepped back. He didn't know what she would do next, but he felt that something even more powerful was about to happen. The tension in the air increased. He was accustomed to being the center of attention, but now he found himself powerless before something much greater than his fortune or his status. He was being confronted with the true nature of life, with the fact that the world doesn't revolve around his wealth or his superiority. He who always thought himself the master of the game was now about to learn that the game wasn't his to control. Sarah, still standing, observed Henry's reaction. She didn't need to do anything more. What she had done was already done. She knew he was broken, but there was still something more to be said. Something that wasn't about power or revenge, but about the pure force of will. You live in a world where you believe you can manipulate everything around you. But the real world doesn't work like that, Henry. It was never yours to control. Sarah's words reverberated in the silence like a sentence. Henry looked at her with an expression that mixed confusion, frustration, and a fear he wasn't accustomed to feeling. He wanted to shout, wanted to demand something back, but there was nothing he could do. He didn't know how to react. He didn't know how to control the situation. He felt for the first time that he was small. He didn't have the power he thought he had, and this realization was destroying him. Sarah, in turn, didn't move. She remained there, motionless, but with a presence so intense it seemed to occupy all the space around. She knew Henry was defeated, but it wasn't her victory that mattered. What mattered was the truth being revealed, the understanding that he was nothing more than a part of a larger game, a game he would never have complete control over. Henry, with a distant look, finally moved away. He didn't know where to go. He didn't know what to do. He, the man who had always believed himself unbeatable, was now facing a woman who had taken from him what he most feared losing: control. He left without saying a word, without looking back, knowing nothing would ever be the same. What he thought he had was now irrelevant. He was no longer the man who dominated the world around him. Sarah, in silence, watched him leave. She knew the lesson had been given, and that on some level he would never forget what happened there. She didn't need him to fully understand. She knew the world, in its essence, was about moments like that, where appearances fall apart and truth finally comes to light. The morning wind began to change when Henry finally moved away. He didn't stop to look back, and perhaps that was better. He knew he was leaving, but didn't know where to. The feeling of loss of control was overwhelming. For him, he had always had control. Everything in his life, from the way he walked the streets to the companies he commanded, had always been meticulously orchestrated. He saw himself as a leader, a master of his destiny, and until that day he believed his worldview was indisputable. But leaving Sarah there, he knew something profound had changed in his life. It was as if, looking at her, he had glimpsed a truth that was beyond his reach, something that was beyond his ability to understand. He felt weak, small, and unable to deal with the situation. Something within him had been broken, something he never knew existed. He didn't know if he would have the courage to look in the mirror again, because he knew he would no longer be the same person reflected back at him. Sarah remained standing, watching him move away. There was no celebration, no relief in her expression. She knew what had happened. There wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about humiliating Henry Devereaux, although he was undoubtedly humiliated. It was about something greater, something that transcends any physical confrontation. She had conquered something few can understand. The control she had over the situation wasn't about physical strength. It wasn't about the blow she had dealt or the humiliation she had caused. Her control was in something deeper, something Henry would never comprehend. The truth about who she was, the unbeatable power of human resistance. The streets around continued their routines. The sound of traffic, the hurried steps of other individuals on their way, all of this happened as if nothing significant had occurred. But for Sarah, everything was different. She felt the city's vibration, but not like before. She was no longer invisible. She had freed herself not only from the chains of the system that marginalized her, but also from the weight of a life that for so long tried to place limitations on her journey. With each step she took, the world around seemed broader, more open. She didn't need anyone's approval to feel whole, and that was something Henry would never have. Sarah knew that on some level, her story, no matter how hard Henry tried to avoid it, would remain marked in his mind. He would return to his life of luxury, to his businesses, to his world of power. But deep down, he would carry an image in his mind, the image of her, a homeless woman, a woman with a military past he had underestimated, and who, in that brief encounter, had changed his understanding of the world. Perhaps he would never be able to acknowledge it, but the lesson he learned there would be eternal, deeper than any material goods he could accumulate. As he moved away with hunched shoulders and a lost gaze, Sarah felt a strange tranquility take hold of her. She knew what had just happened there wouldn't be the end of the story. Not for Henry, and certainly not for her. What was at stake wasn't the momentary victory over that man, but something greater, a constant struggle against a system that tries to dehumanize those who somehow are outside the radar. Sarah was part of that, but she would no longer be a victim. She knew that no matter how much the world denied her, she was intact. She knew her worth, knew the depth of her being. Henry Devereaux, no matter how hard he tried to convince himself otherwise, now had something that would mark him forever. The understanding that he was facing a woman who, despite everything, never bowed. And that was the true defeat for him. As Sarah watched Henry moving away, a feeling of control, but also of resignation, took hold of her. It wasn't the end of the story, but perhaps it was the beginning of something deeper. The world had been harsh with her, and she knew she would still face many obstacles. But she also knew that what Henry Devereaux experienced that day would be a constant reminder of his weakness. And with each memory he had of her, he would know that at some point he had been defeated, not by physical force, but by a much more powerful force. The force of survival, resilience, and truth. Sarah slowly moved away without looking back. She didn't need anything more. She knew what had happened. There wasn't just a clash of egos or a simple power struggle. It was a landmark. The world could continue to turn, but for her, this moment was eternalized. Henry could follow his life of luxury, but he now carried a memory that would change everything forever. And in that moment, Sarah felt freer than she had ever been. She knew that more than a victory over an arrogant man, she had conquered something even more grand. She had conquered her own freedom. The story of Sarah and Henry Devereaux isn't just about power, status, or wealth. It's about the true strength that resides within each of us. Many spend their lives believing that strength is in what we possess, in what we show the world, in the things we buy, or the positions we occupy. But as we've seen, true strength doesn't come from any of that. It comes from within, from control over our own story, from resilience in the face of adversity, from the courage to remain firm when the world tries to diminish us. Have you ever felt like Henry with total control of the situation, believing nothing could stop you? Or like Sarah, at some point in your life, underestimated, discredited, but with an unbreakable strength you hadn't yet realized? What will be your reaction when life challenges you? Will you bow or will you rise, with the strength you didn't even know you had, and show the world who you really are? Reflect on this. This is the moment for you to ask yourself, what am I doing with my life? Am I allowing others to define my value? Or am I allowing myself to be my most powerful version? Are you ready to take control? Are you prepared to face challenges and fight for your freedom, for your right to be who you really are? Now it's your turn. What will you do to change your reality and free yourself from the limitations the world imposes? Are you willing to take the reins of your own story, just as Sarah did that day, facing adversity and transforming your weakness into your greatest strength? If you're ready to take on this journey, if you're ready to learn more about how to empower yourself, about how to transform your life from the inside out, and about how to become the best version of yourself, subscribe to our channel and activate notifications. Don't miss the chance to learn more about stories that inspire, teach, and most importantly, motivate change. And remember, change begins with you. Are you ready to take the first step? Then subscribe now and let's walk together to the next level.